Welcome and thank you for joining City Parks Alliance, World Urban Parks, and the World Parks Academy for a webinar exploring strategies for managing biodiversity in a changing climate. I'm Karen Ernst, and I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the City Parks Alliance, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm going to share my screen now. Sorry. All right, great. World Urban Parks is one of our collaborating organizations, and they are a collaboration of organizations that's engaged in learning across boundaries and borders. To learn more about World Urban Parks and get engaged, you can go to their website or follow them on social media. This webinar is also being produced in partnership with Indiana University's Epley Institute through their World Urban Parks Academy and through the City Parks Alliance. Our speakers today are Enriquez Flores and Yvonne Lynch, who will share strategies from their work in 3 geographically diverse cities, León, Riyadh, and Melbourne. The speakers will share how they are using parks and urban forests as laboratories to understand the impacts of climate change and to test effective adaptation and management strategies. Enriquez Flores is the Director General of Parque Metropolitano de León in Mexico. Germán is an environmental engineer with a specialization in bioresource technologies. He's worked in sustainability and environmental disaster relief projects worldwide as a member of Engineers Without Borders in its Danish chapter, in local environmental education and infrastructure programs as the area director in León Environmental Department, and as an analyst and researcher in Novozymes in Denmark. Yvonne Lynch is an urban greening and climate resilience strategist who currently works with the Royal Commission for Riyadh City on the Green Riyadh program, which aims to create 3,300 new parks for the city and gardens for the city by 2030. She advises governments international on urban greening programs, and she established and led the City of Melbourne's Urban Forest and Ecology team and has engaged thousands of Melbournians in greening and biodiversity activities. So I'm going to turn it over to Germán, but I just wanted to let you know that you are welcome to submit questions throughout the presentations in the Q&A box that's in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We'll hold questions until Germán and Yvonne are done with their presentations.
All right, thank you very much, Karen, Maggie, and everyone from World Urban Parks, World Parks Academy, and City Parks Alliance. It's an honor to be here, and especially discussing about this topic because it's always great to share and to learn what is being done around the world, and especially what we're gonna share is about what has been done in a particular city in Mexico, which is a little bit of a Latin American context, and all the challenges that we're facing. I mean, not only in terms of climate change, but also economically, socially, and well, everything that has to do with the urban spaces and biodiversity. So in this case, well, I'll get right into it. Then again, thank you very much for the opportunity to present this. And I'm really excited to be sharing it with Yvonne Lynch, which she's working in amazing projects that we'll learn a little bit more after this. All right, so first of all, I'll talk about the city of León, just to put it in a regional context. Where is León located? Well, León is like the 5th largest city in Mexico. It's located right in the center of Mexico in an inland geographical location. And we are a city that we have about 1.8 million people. Right, so the climate characteristics of León, just to put a little bit of context, León is pretty much in the same latitude as the Sahara Desert. However, we have a pretty considerate elevation of almost 2,000 meters above sea level. Therefore, we have a really blessed climate in terms of temperature and precipitation. We could call the city a dry city in terms of, even if we get the annual precipitation equivalent to London, the thing is that London gets it like pretty spread all around the year, and we get almost like more than 3/4 of the total rain in just 1 or 2 months. So there is a lot of storms here. The weather is pretty much temperate and subhumid. It's a mountainous region. Therefore, we are really vulnerable to floods and droughts. So we have a huge water crisis in this region, and that's something that climate change is uh, is not uh, is not helping at all. Okay, so in León, we just conducted a study based on the Singapore Index, or better known as the City Biodiversity Index, which is a great tool for cities around the world to know what to do, or where do they stand in terms of biodiversity management. In this case, well, León is score is kind of average. There's a lot of things to do, and I would just like to highlight one of the main problems that we have. For example, the only category that we score 0 points is how many visits per year for a child under 16 years old that they go to recreational or educational centers such as parks. And we have a really low rate of people going to parks in order to learn about biodiversity and ecosystems. So that right there is something that is a red alert for us that we need to work a lot on. And I mean, I would be more tempted to speak about the good things, but I guess that the bad things are really important in a Latin American context, because this is something that you can relate to a lot of cities in Latin America. Other other categories that we don't score very high is in terms of how we regulate water management, and at the same time, cooling effects from vegetation. Showing you a little bit of the map of how León is geographically. What you can see in the left, the darker red spots, it's pretty much the mountain range that we got in the north of the city. And the lighter red is almost pink. That's the urban area. So as you can see, in the north, we have a mountainous range where a lot of water falls down, and there all this water flows right into the city. In the right side, you can see all these different green spots that we could say that they're the urban ecosystems. There is not a lot of connection between them, and they are pretty pulverized. I mean, the biggest one, which is Parque Metropolitano, the park that I manage, is the biggest one, but nonetheless, there is a lot of things there that could be done better, which is a great analysis in order to realize what can be done. Okay, so speaking a little bit about how to manage all these climate effects on the city, there is an interesting story about how this Parque Metropolitano came to be. As you can see, it's in the north, right where all this mountain range connects to the city. What happened is that almost one century ago, 150 years ago, the city was really vulnerable to flooding. So all this water that came from the mountains pretty much made a disaster in the city. You can see pictures on the right from 1888, one of the most disastrous floods that we got, and in 1926. So in 1953, it was decided to build a dam, a regulatory dam, right in the north of the city. There was nothing over there. So it was a dam from the 50s until the 90s, where in the 90s, there was this great idea of let's transform it into a park. Because, I mean, as an inland city in the middle of a mountainous region, we didn't have any lakes, or natural lakes per se. So that solved the problem for a few years, right? Well, what is happening later on? This is from 2016. As you can see, we still have a problem, and a pretty serious one at that. So what needs to be done? This is another map from this study that we did in terms of the permeability of the city. I mean, what are the areas of the city that water can filter to all these, to these groundwater spaces? The blue ones are the most permeable spaces, which they relate to the parks that we have. As you can see, we don't have a lot. I mean, the ones we have most, the areas that are more suitable for this function are Parque Metropolitano as well, and it starts becoming more permeable as you go into more natural areas. So there is a huge challenge here, and this brings me to one of the main things of the environmental services of parks. Parks help a lot in order to regulate stormwater and to save from these kind of disasters. I mean, more than speaking about oxygen production and other services, they really are the last line of defense against these extreme weather events, which climate change is really accelerating and making them worse year by year. So parks are super important in that sense. Well, let me speak about great things. Okay, let me just share a little bit about the park that we are managing. It's a natural protected area. This is a real picture. It's 370 hectares. It's quite big for a park. Almost most of the area is covered by this water body. And it's one great example of how a reservoir dam, there are hundreds of them around the world, they can be adapted to provide recreation and parklands into any city almost. So in terms of biodiversity, I'll be speaking more into what kind of biodiversity we have in this park, which is representative of the whole region. So in terms of animals and fauna, we have 220 species. Most of them are birds, and this artificial lake became a sanctuary for birds. I mean, almost 171 species can be seen there. It's really a haven for birds. But we also have mammals, some bats, squirrels, regular urban fauna, some fish that is being planted there artificially in order for some commercial purposes, reptiles, and some amphibians as well. In terms of flora and trees, we did a recent census, and we have almost 3,345 trees of 48 species. There is a lot of interesting work in terms of how to choose the right species in terms of a changing climate, which again, I can't wait to hear Yvonne speaking about the project that they did in Melbourne, which is amazing, where we actually got a lot of inspiration. Okay, here's the species that we are showing. Not all of them are native from a region, but some of them have adapted beautifully. As you can see in the picture, the jacaranda, these kind of our cherry blossoms, but in the southern latitudes, is this tree. Well, it's not from the region, but it has really been proven to bring a lot of environmental benefits. All right, so what I'm going to share with you in terms of best practices of how to manage biodiversity in a changing climate with a focus on urban parks, I'm going to divide it into two sections. First, in terms of adaptation, what kind of things we're doing, and also in terms of education. So bear with me. Okay, so the first thing that I would like to speak about is about fauna monitoring, which is kind of the most straightforward thing that whenever we think about biodiversity, is like, okay, let's see a lot of species, right? So it is very important to train people in order to appreciate what there is, because 171 species of birds, that's a lot. Yeah, but I can assure you that most people that go to the park every day to exercise, they don't distinguish between, I mean, yeah, for sure they can tell a pelican from a flamingo, right? But other birds, they are not aware of how rare and how important they are in several senses. So in that way, the approach that we have been following in terms of fauna monitoring is based on community engagement. Community engagement has proven to be one of the best practices for everything that has to do with urban parks. And in terms of bird watching and fauna monitoring and even registering, the more eyes you get, the more data you will have. This guy in the right is called Mauricio Mena. He's a high school principal. He doesn't work in the park, but he has been the person that has contributed with the most registered species of all time. I mean, not even our rangers do that. This guy, he has a huge passion about it, and we have learned to work amazingly well with him. And well, he's building groups of community in terms of fauna monitoring. We also have the Rangers program that we just started, but I'll talk about it a little bit later. So thanks to that, since 2017 that we started these community engagement practices in order not to do it all by ourselves, but to let the community in a crowdsourcing kind of way feel this. Well, we have registered 56 new species in just a couple of years. And that has two explanations. I mean, one of them is that, then again, with more trained eyes, you register more things. But then again, climate change is super important in this matter. Migration patterns are changing. What you see in this picture, it was taken in March of 2020. It went viral because in the middle of a Mexican city, we got this pack of bobcats that they came down from the mountain range because we've had a really dry year. So all this fauna is looking for places, for safe havens in order to find water and to find food. And urban parks can provide that. So anyway, this links was a great experience for a lot of people to become engaged of, okay, what are we doing? What kind of species? Okay, you got bobcats, what else you got? You got flamingos. You got flamingos. Yeah, we got flamingos. This is an amazing story of how biodiversity can really help bring awareness to people about a lot of issues in terms of climate change and urban exploitation. Let me tell you a story about the guy in the left. The guy in the left, he arrived in around 2017 or 2016, but almost no one noticed that there was a flamingo in the middle of a Mexican city, which is not normal at all. By the time that I started working at the park and I noticed, I was super excited about it. And in one interview, when they were asking me some difficult questions about like, what did the last director do and why he was fired? And he's like, I don't want to get into that. So let me see, how can I distract the misdirection? Oh, have you seen the flamingo? His name is Flavio, and Flavio became a rock star. Flavio nowadays is super famous in terms of, okay, there's a natural wild flamingo here. So that was in 2017. In 2018, we had a visitor, which is the flamingo on the right, whose origin was super special. Flavio, he's an American flamingo. That's kind of natural because the Northern Hemisphere and it's okay to be there. But Frida, who's, well, later the people name it Frida, Frida is a Chilean flamingo, and the picture that you're seeing in your screen is the first picture of these two species actually, well, getting together in the middle of a place that is not, it was not suitable for flamingos. But what we're seeing here is these examples of bird migration that they tell us a lot of what's going on in a world terms basis. So then again, Mauricio Mena, Luis Ave, Bird Luis, this is this amazing photographer. He did a webinar about all his bird sites, and as you can see, there are thousands of them, and how he has been following these two flamingos. Well, right now we have a third flamingo that is called Fede. So the story of the flamingos keeps going on. So, well, that's the thing about more fauna, right? But at the same time, we have seen that some species are no longer seen. And that's important in order to see like what is going on in terms of bird migration. So only 5 species in these last 3 years, we have not seen them anymore. And this is something that has raised awareness of us of the need to build these networks among all, well, pretty much all around America. In terms of North America, you know that boundaries and all these barriers and walls, that's human political stuff. For animals, they don't care about it. And birds, they tell us every time that they don't care about it. We had a nice experience with Scott, who is a super bird watcher aficionado, along with his lovely wife, Jen. And he emailed me like 1 year ago about like, okay, we got this house ranch. How is it going over there? Maybe it came from your park. And actually, the week before, we have stopped seeing this house ranch, which in Spanish is called chivirin saltapared, like wall jumper chivi something. So anyway, this tells you the connection that there can be built among all the different parks. So this is a really great initiative that we are trying to work a little bit further. We also established another contact in Canada with dear Ben John in Edmonton. So this is coming along somehow. And if you are interested in that, let's talk about it. Let's build this network, and that can provide a lot of data. All right, so that was fauna monitoring. I'm going to speed up a little bit. But then adaptive tree management, I won't speak a lot about this because, again, Yvonne can tell us way more about it. But anyway, the thing about adaptive tree management is that the climate is changing. So if the climate change, then the species change because they need to adapt each other. Maybe trees that were planted that they tried 50 years ago, they won't in 20 years. So we need to adapt to that. In that sense, we have adapted all this Melbourne philosophy of how to adapt the species to the new climate that our cities are migrating. In this sense, we have planted almost 1,640 trees since 2017, choosing really carefully the species. For example, most of the resilient species that we plant is called mesquite, this Prosopis levigata, because this mesquite has a lot of cooling factor potential in terms of making urban areas cooler. And also is one of the regional species that they thrive in they're super resistant to this kind of weather, and they do wonders for soil. So that's one of the examples, but then again, I'll let Yvonne tell more about it. In terms of monitoring all the trees, we have been using the iTree platform that gives you tons of data that can be really interesting. Like, for example, I mean, environmental services, but by numbers, I mean, by science. How much oxygen is being produced by these almost 14,000 trees? Is it a lot? Are parks really the lungs of the city? Well, let me tell you, it's 345 tons per year. So is that enough for what? A city of almost 2 million people? Well, that is the amount of oxygen that is enough for 90 people. So then again, parks are not really the lungs of the city, but they are something even more important. They are the immune system of the city. They can really protect cities from all these dangerous effects of climate change. So anyway, in this anatomical analogy, I just wanted to clear it out because that always bugs me when I hear that parks are the lungs of the city. They are much more than that. And they are not pretty particularly so great in terms of lung capacity. That's in adaptive tree management. And part of it, one of the main effects that we have been dealing and that has been super expensive in terms of tree management is plague control. These little birds that you see in your lower right corner are called the little Argentinian parrots. These guys look lovely, right? I mean, it's great to see them. But these guys, I'm really angry at them because they are not from here. And it's okay, they're welcome, but please don't bring other plagues. They're doing that. All this mistletoe that maybe in the UK is, and the northern latitudes is a Christmas tradition to kiss under the mistletoe. Well, yes, it's cool to have mistletoe over there because in harsh winters, it dies. But in hot weather or in mild climate, it survives and it can really drain a tree. I mean, it's a plague and it's really hard to get rid of. And also ball moths. So anyway, new bird migration carries new plagues, and that's something that we need to be really resilient about it. So what, imagine this, 86 hectares were affected back in the beginning of 2019, and we treat 82 hectares with a lot of collaboration. And here is a great opportunity of how to make the most of it. This is a new job. These are new opportunities of how to employ people to do this. And who better to do this than people from rural communities that they're exposed to it, and that since it's a really artisanal work, they can really benefit from there. So we, in the state, we train 40 workers from rural communities in order to deal with all these gigantic jobs, and they got paid and the park got clean, and it was a win-win situation. So that's a good sense of how to adapt to these effects of climate change. And also, if you don't see them, you won't understand what it is about. We made in this kind of educational sense how to make it like little critters, like Dr. Mario kind of thing, of Pokemon. So children can identify these plagues and don't say like, oh, they're so pretty. Well, yeah, it can be pretty, but it's bad for the environment that we have nowadays. So this has worked a lot in order to raise awareness of all these plagues. So that's in terms of adaptation. And just to finish, I'll go into the last section, which education. all these we need in order to deal with all the effects of climate change. We need capacity building. We need different organizational structures for how to deal with it. It's no longer just gardening. We need forestry management. We need horticultural experts. And also in terms of taking care of the park or watching, we can no longer just employ security guards. And this is the example of what happened. We have been working for 2 years, since 2 years ago. At the beginning, we had this huge staff made of pretty much the security guard idea, right? Okay, we have 50 people on security, which they are only just watching. But while they're watching crime, and well, you're in a park. So taking the model of the National Park Service ranger system of the US, we have implemented, along with the state authorities, these park rangers programs where, for example, Guzman, right in the middle of Silvia, that they started working in the park security guards. They came from working in shopping malls or anyway. It was just a really self-fulfilling job, which was just to gain money. And now they have a career. Thanks to this, they have become rangers. They're super proud of their work. They have better salaries, and they are also the educators of the park, where they go outside the park and even teach them. So it's not just rangers. We also need to train our people in order to how to gather data, because without data, it's really hard to manage, and especially something as crucial as biodiversity. We need to learn informatical systems. So anyway, we have been training them in this matter. And for example, in the right, you see one of the rangers that now is a rock star, because every single Monday he has a live show on Facebook, on our social media, where he guides everyone that nowadays that you cannot go to the park. Well, we bring the park to you by a bird watching activity. His name is Lupillo, and Lupillo is really feeling like a rock star. And well, down there, you can see like what used to be the activities before all this happened. Anyway, also, it's not just environmental education anymore. Climate change has aroused a lot of different problems, and it's just not climate change. I mean, the pandemics and all these different things that are going on. So environmental education falls short on what parks can offer. So in this term, we have taken an education for sustainable development approach that takes care of all the sustainable development goals that we need to better the world for, right? I mean, this 2030 agenda from the UN, it can be really adapted to parks. Parks are the perfect platform for that. For example, in terms of inequality, well, through community programming, we can help reach that goal. In terms of terrestrial ecosystems, well, the conservation, biodiversity, in partnerships, parks are meant to talk to each other. And all of the other goals, they can be related to parks. So we are taking that approach. And through this approach, we have developed this platform that has an educational program, infrastructure based on education, research, and communication. For example, in terms of all the signs that you can find in the park, we really got into the terms of how to make it so evident for people that didn't see the bird. Now you can see the sign and then you see the bird, and then you learn things that you probably didn't know before. In terms of parks, imagine we have the biggest lake in the region, and maybe children cannot understand what is climate change, but you can explain it to him like, remember in 2015 when you went to the park and there was no water at all. And then in 2018 that you went again and it was 140% capacity and everything was flooded and there was bridges everywhere. That is not normal, right? Well, this is climate change in a tangible way. Also infrastructure, how to make it, for example, zebra crosswalks to make it more stable. We did this with different university design studios to design every crosswalk so they can represent a different SDG, a sustainable development goal. In terms of every time that this tree management that I was telling you, I mean, to make it really tangible for people to know what is going on. And every single activity that we do, we need to involve not only environmental education, but also social and economic education, because in terms of community. So that in terms of ACD approach. And just to finish, research and collaboration. This hands down is one of the most important things that we need to learn to do in order to manage the biodiversity in climate change. Climate change, I had prepared a little bit of slides to talk to you about climate change, but anyway, to put it really easy, the Earth absorbs radiation from the sun. That's how we get warm, and that's how we get energy. However, in terms of radiation, sometimes we absorb and we reflect some. This balance is regulated by this tiny glass that is called the atmosphere in terms of the greenhouse gases. And the thicker it is, the more energy we absorb, and the thinner it is, the more energy we send to space. We have just the right balance around 200 years ago. It was 14 degrees Celsius, the temperature of the Earth. That was amazing. However, with all these different gases that they take care of this greenhouse layer, it has become thicker and thicker and thicker, and now we absorb more. In 2019, we reached 15 degrees. In other words, 1 degree warmer. If we reach 2 degrees, that is the point of no return, but you already knew that. So what have we been doing in terms of research? One of the main things in terms of how to deal with climate change, we did this greenhouse gases inventory model with the University of Tennessee and Tec de Monterrey. That is a really easy model in order to replicate in other parks, of taking into account the operation of the park, all the emissions, all the greenhouse gases emissions, like fuel, electric energy, trash, and all that, how much it adds up in a really simple model. And also all the things that a park has based on natural things like a water reservoir or tree inventory, that they actually absorb these gases. So I can share with you later through all these platforms, these studies. It's a really easy to implement model. But for example, Parque Metropolitano, we mitigate 390 tons of CO2 per year. Is that a lot? It's just the equivalent of taking out 120 cars from the city per year. In León, we have 500,000 cars. So anyway, other types of research, sustainable fishing, how to do it sustainably in the park, also mosquito monitoring, because one of the effects of climate change in our city is dengue, this disease that was not usually found in these higher altitudes, but this mosquito, the one in the middle, has been adapting. So we are monitoring to see how this is being developed in the city. And all these amazing institutions that all of them can share with it. I mean, I'm super excited to be part of this network, and I just put some of them. I mean, all around the world, there are people doing amazing things, and we're not alone. That's super important. In terms of conclusions, because I went a little bit ahead over time, I would just like to say these conclusions that for me are like the key points of getting out of what I have just talked. First of all, the roles of urban parks on climate change, or in our experience, are mitigation, adaptation, and education. Second, on mitigation, the main environmental services that parks provide are stormwater management and urban cooling. In terms of oxygen, then again, is not that much. So parks, third, are more the city's immune system than its lungs, if we need to do an anatomic analogy. Four, we need to learn in order to appreciate. We need to learn to observe in order to appreciate. And parks have a super amazing educator role in this. As it has been said, no one will protect what they don't care about, and no one will care about what they have never experienced. Quote by Jacques Cousteau. Anyway, so this is pretty much what I had to say. Thank you very much. And I would just like to end up with this anecdote. This bird is called tortilla con chile in Spanish. And you know why? Because its chirp sounds like what? So tortilla con chile. That kind of genius things are the things that stick the most for all the users. And anyway, there is a lot of ways of how to manage biodiversity and climate change, but we really need to take the education role. Thank you very much. That's it for me.
All right, thank you, Herman. Can you pass your screen over to Yvonne, and we'll get started. We're running a few minutes behind, so we'll pass it on to Yvonne. All right, go ahead.
Sure, thank you. You can hear me okay? Okay, so thank you, Herman, for that really great presentation. It was very inspiring and enjoyable. And it's lovely to join you all tonight. And I'm going to talk about two cities that I've worked with and show examples of their work. And I'll say their work because it's not all mine. There's big teams behind these projects that I will show you. I guess I want to start off just by pointing out that it's really important in context of climate change adaptation to remember that each city has their own unique trajectory, which is influenced by a multitude of variables from the location of the city, the size, its economy, heritage, culture, politics. We all start our work on adaptation from these different contexts. And I think being aware of those influencing factors for your place and thinking about how you use them to your advantage or navigate them can greatly shape the scope of your work for success. I'm going to start off this evening with a map of Saudi Arabia to show you where it is, because it's in the middle of the Arabian Gulf and it has a population of about 35 million people. But the reason I put the map there is because my friends still ask me, how am I doing in Dubai, which is in the United Arab Emirates and a different country altogether. So it's still surprising to me that such an influential country in the Gulf region is unknown to many people. And if you don't know it, then you probably don't know how hot it is here either. So this is just a snapshot from today. Saudi Arabia lives in the climate extremes that most cities around the world are actually preparing to either adapt to or avoid. And, you know, all I can say looking at today's temperature is that it's been colder today here than it has been for weeks. It's not uncommon to have days above 120 Fahrenheit. For most of you, that's a heat wave, but here in Saudi Arabia, that's summer. Riyadh is the capital city of Saudi Arabia, and it's a city that's experienced extraordinary growth in recent decades. As you can see on the map there, in 1950, it was a small little oasis in the desert and it had a population of under 50,000 people. And then you fast forward to 2020 and it now has a population of 7 million people. It's a sprawling metropolis rather than a little oasis anymore. And what you might also notice from these aerial images, particularly the one on the right, is that there's very little green cover. Here are some of the shots of the city so that you can see what the city looks like right now. So here are some of the heritage architecture, I guess. This is one of the wadis and some of the cooler parts of the city. And here you can see that it is very much a heavily urbanized place and a place that's continuing to develop. And of course, it experiences all of the same problems that other cities experience. One of the projects that I'm working on at the moment is the Green Riyadh project. So this is one of 4 well-being projects for the city that was announced about 2 years ago. The Green Riyadh initiative is very much focused around ecosystem service provision for the city and focused around how through ecosystem service provision we can improve the health and well-being of the community. And of course, it's underpinned by a strategic framework, which I won't spend much time on now. But out of that framework falls a number of very significant transformative implementation activities for the city. And I draw your attention to the numbers there. They're absolutely extraordinary in terms of the breadth and the scope of what's planned to be done in the city. So, for example, it's planned that over 3,300 new parks and gardens will be created at the neighbourhood scale. And then on top of that, 43 new city scale parks, so really large parks, including one which is planned to be one of the biggest urban parks on the planet. And you can see there thousands of mosques and schools to be greened alongside thousands of kilometres along the roads. So it really is quite ambitious in its scope, and it really is looking for that transformation of urban greening. Currently, the canopy and the green ratio of the city sits at about just over 1%, and the goal is to take that up to over 9% by 2030. And of course, the question on everybody's mind when you talk about this program is water. And I'll draw your attention there. You can see the average mean rainfall, which is quite low. But the intention here is to provide water for greening from treated wastewater. I guess it's important to acknowledge that there's over 7 million people here in the city, and they're using water every day, and nothing is done with that water, the grey water or the black water. And so what's underway right now is the finalization of a master planning process to create what I'll say is probably going to be one of the largest water recycling networks in the world. And that in itself is going to be the core source of water for the city's new parks and trees. And what I do want to focus on are the trees. I believe the trees are just a critical focus area, the same as the water. To create the parks and green roads for the city, we've calculated that we'll need at least 7 million healthy new trees growing in parks and streets. And so factoring in tree mortality, it looks like we'll be planning for around 10 million trees in total. And currently the tree growing industry here is not as professionalized as it is in other countries. And that presents somewhat of a challenge because we want locally grown trees here in Riyadh. We're not looking for imported trees. And so while maybe some of the initial trees at the beginning of the program will be imported, what we're focusing on right now is developing the skills of the local growers so they're growing healthier, more resilient trees. And we're also developing our own nursery to become a center of excellence and to manage things like propagation of quality tree stock and genetic diversity. And diversity is very important to us, and understanding how we can apply it. For tree diversity in Riyadh, we have a target of no more than 30% of a family, no more than 20% of a genus, and 5% of a species, or 10% of a species. And that is a challenge here. In Melbourne, the targets were half of this. But here, given the context of extreme high temperatures and extreme low rainfall, there's a very narrow range of trees that can grow within those thresholds. And as you can see from the screen here, we've developed species lists. We're looking at factors like water consumption, salinity, tolerance, and looking at how we spatially distribute diversity across the city. And we've benchmarked against other cities to see where Riyadh sits. You can see it's not so bad in terms of plant species, but then if you look at, say, Melbourne at the top of the scale, over 6,000 plant species in the city compared to 3,000, you do realize that there is potential to increase the palette even in an arid zone. And also we're focused, while we do know we have to plant a broad variety of trees, and some of them are going to be exotic, we're looking at how we increase the local plant species as well, where the city currently sits on that spectrum. Diversity is really important, and I think it's going to be becoming more and more important every year. It's important to understand that our trees as living entities are always vulnerable. And so issues like pests and diseases are going to become more prevalent, particularly as the climate continues to warm. And we know we've already warmed by 1.5 degrees. All it's going to take is one uncontrolled pest or disease to wipe out an entire species or genus, or population of trees. And indeed, we've seen that happen in some places. If you look at the bottom left of the screen there, you can see Canal du Midi in France with those beautiful plane trees, and they've had to remove most of those trees from that because of one disease. So one of the things that is also going to be important in context of diversity is understanding if you don't have something, what can you actually plant? And so looking at trials for testing new species of trees. So one of the first pieces of research we did here in Riyadh was to engage an Australian researcher called David Kendall to look at the impact that climate change is having here on tree growth. He analysed thousands of trees from hot climates around the world to determine new species that might be suitable to use and trial here in Riyadh. And then he also identified vulnerable species that we need to monitor and plant in conservative numbers. Some of the interesting things that he found was that actually water availability isn't really a factor in terms of looking at new trees, but more so the temperature thresholds are going to be the critical item to monitor. And for this work, he drew freely on the available databases which are managed by the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. They have thousands of contributors from around the world. You can see here is just a quick snapshot at the Saudi Arabian databases. They have them for every country, and this is Australia. And also for me, a nice segue to move into Melbourne and talk about some of the work there. So Melbourne has been working on an ecosystem-based climate adaptation program for well over a decade now. And the goal of that program is to look at cooling the city by 4 degrees Celsius, because heat is also a big problem in Melbourne, as is low water availability. And so there's a number of strategies that feed into that report, touching everything from open space to green roofs and a variety of other things. But of course, the core component of it is looking at trees. And so growing the canopy cover in the city from 20% to 40% is going to be the critical factor in achieving those cooler temperatures. And of course, like Herman mentioned in León, stormwater harvesting is also important in Melbourne. And there's a very big focus on how we capture and reuse the day-to-day stormwater that's generated. Currently, the city has the capacity to irrigate its parks and gardens to the extent of 30% from captured stormwater, and that's increasing each year as they continue to implement. Like I mentioned, this work that Dave Kendall undertook around tree species and the implications for climate change on tree growth has also been conducted in Melbourne, and that study is freely available online and will be shared after. But in Melbourne, a lot of the work has been built around continuing research. So there's also been some dendrochronological studies done of the trees to understand in detail for particular species what impacts various weather patterns have on the trees. It's been established from the dendrochronological studies that probably in about 10 to 15 years, you're not going to have the temperature thresholds that elm trees can survive in, for example. And they're pretty iconic with Melbourne as a city. So the planners there are now looking at how they really use diversity and similar species to elms to kind of manage that and plant also elms still, but in a much more conservative manner than had been previously. And I will mention just on the pest and disease fact that, and you probably know this anyway, that you know, in terms of Dutch elms have been wiped out in most cities around the world except Melbourne, because that disease has been very carefully managed and not been introduced there yet. But that's what I mean when I say diversity is becoming more and more critical. But it's not just about diversity of tree species or anything just focused on that. It's also about having diversity of landscapes. So in Melbourne, there's been very much a push now to move away from this very traditional treatment of parks to just having turf and trees and some nicely groomed flower beds. We're looking at wild landscapes and where they can be introduced and how they can support biodiversity, particularly insect biodiversity. And also, it's not just limited to spaces on ground. Obviously, green walls and green roofs are becoming a very big focus in Melbourne as well, with legislation now supporting and promoting the establishment of green roofs and walls across the city. And a critical factor of most of the work in Melbourne has been community. And the interesting thing is we often, when we think about community participation or collaboration in greening projects, we often think about them on site and planting trees or shrubs or whatever it might be, doing something. But in Melbourne, a core focus of our work, certainly in the 10 years that I was there, was to integrate community into the planning stages from the very beginning. And with the biodiversity strategy, which is called Nature in the City. The community were invited in when that strategy was still a blank page, and they got to shape and inform most of the goals and aims in that strategy. And not only did they help write it from scratch, but also they helped collect and gather the data for that strategy. Up until 2014, there was actually no biodiversity records in the city other than those collected by volunteer groups and by the various academic institutions. And so one of the things we did was to start to work with community interest in greening by engaging them in urban bioblitzes. And they've been highly successful and have been repeated several times. One of the really successful ones for us was around insects. And so you can see there's a picture of one of the groups on the very first Urban BioBlitz. And this one was led by an entomologist who's there in the red, Luis Mata. And he has since been commissioned to conduct insect biodiversity research, building on from the citizen engagement work that was done. And for that work, what we did was we put together an insect or a website on the insects. And so I think Herman mentioned, that many community members can't ID birds. Well, they certainly can't ID insects, and it's a little bit worse for the insects because they don't even like them in the first place. And so a lot of our biodiversity and healthy biodiversity and ecosystem services in cities actually rely on insects. And so helping them thrive means having friendly humans for them as well. So building understanding of the importance of insects in the city is important. So there is a whole website in Melbourne now dedicated to insects. This is it. And from the research that Luis has done, the findings have been published on there. And some of the interesting things that were discovered was that 97% of the species of insects surveyed were native, which was fantastic. And the interesting finding was 60% of the insect species live in the mid-story vegetation, so between the canopy and the ground cover. And so that actually informed a lot of policy development in the city around, like I said, moving away from just turf and tree treatments of our parks and our roads to actually looking at how we increase mid-story to improve conditions and habitat for insects. And like I said, people don't tend to be drawn towards the insects. And so one of the things we did with that research was to publish a book which was circulated to all of the schools in the city to help run classes and educate the children at a very young age about the positive benefits of insects, and also for them to be able to identify their native Australian insects, many of which are not known. And from that, we built on to develop a website around butterflies. And this was, again, based on community surveys and research surveys. But the purpose of it is to open the community's eyes to what's in the city, and also to develop that understanding of how plants attract butterflies, which plant attracts which butterflies. And so the website is really interactive, and you can really do a lot to understand what's in the city, and if you plant something, what it's likely to attract, which is, it's a really beautiful educational tool. And I'm going to wind down now, but basically before I do, I wanted to draw attention to the fact that while we can do a lot of great things in our cities, and we can dream up really great strategies with ambitious targets and plans, ultimately everything rests on implementation, and involving the community is always acknowledged to be a very important part. But sometimes we kind of neglect to highlight and celebrate the role of many of the people on the ground that actually make that happen, from our rangers, or our rock stars, as Herman has been calling them, to our maintenance crews. And here I've just put some snapshots of citywide, the maintenance crews that do the trees in Melbourne. And recently they've been running a campaign called What We Do Matters. And I guess they've had to run a campaign like that because the work is often not acknowledged. It's seen as maybe basic work, but it's really fundamentally critical to what we do. And in Melbourne, certainly what we were doing citywide was working alongside them, sharing the strategic development work, and starting to integrate their thinking into our plans, which was often, prior done in a hierarchical manner, where, the plan was dreamed up and they were handed to do, but they didn't have any ownership. So now it's about giving them ownership, also acknowledgement. The training is really important because it's interesting when you put a strategy together, next thing you have to do is the implementation plan. And for implementation, if you say, oh, we're going to do a biodiversity corridor, we're going to do this park, or whatever the project might be, how do you know what the best place is? Often these guys are actually the eyes on the ground that can function in a way that actually informs the strategy, not just delivers it. And so drawing down on that brain's trust and integrating them into strategic planning and honoring their knowledge is really, really important. And so I guess moving now to my last slide, I will say that I presented a fairly big program for Green Riyadh. And obviously I would say if there's anybody there, particularly of the landscape architecture disciplines, interested in projects here, that's the website, you know where to go, or email me. We have plenty of work here. So I'll finish up on that, and thank you for listening, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Yvonne, and thank you, Herman, for great presentations. We have unfortunately run out of time for questions, but fortunately you answered a lot of the questions anyway. But I just have one quick question that I'm wondering if the two of you, in a very short answer, could give a suggestion for the cities that want to start replicating some efforts to train citizens and lay people, staff like rangers, on how to do biodiversity monitoring and to collect that data. What's your one tip for a city that wants to get started on really engaging citizens and staff in biodiversity monitoring? Herman, you could go ahead, take it first.
Sure. I mean, right now, I guess in the context of a pandemic, if a virus can be contagious, so do best practices as well. I guess that opening data that you collect data and work on how to present it, because it's there. I mean, biodiversity is there. It's just a matter of how could a game called Pokemon Go could get so many people hooked in this fictional biodiversity when the real world is even more appealing, right? So I guess that data, working the presentation of how you deal with that, and establish clear channels with the community in order for just to start it, because afterwards community takes over and they can go a long way. That will be my suggestion.
All right, Yvonne, anything?
Yeah, I think communication is really important because often we can just target the audiences we know, or our usual suspects are the people that might turn up to be part of any events or initiatives planned. And I think with biodiversity, it's something that, you know, you can always have beautiful pictures, you can always have interesting stories about what's in your city, and targeting your media, your mainstream media for that. I think one of the successful things we did in Melbourne was targeting the tabloid press, because they just loved those stories and those pictures of the various things that were in the city. And through their coverage, that generated a whole new audience that was then interested in participating in citizen bioblitzes and going onto the website to, you know, participate in strategies and development and things like this. So use the media, especially now that they don't have much to talk about except the virus.
All right, use the media, use your local photographers, and engage citizens. All right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen really quickly for just our final talking points, which is just, we have a couple upcoming webinars that people might be interested in. CPA, City Parks Alliance, has 3. One in particular I want to call your attention to, which is our upcoming webinar in October on using climate mitigation and disaster relief funds to build resilient parks. So building on this issue of building more resilient parks, we'll offer some strategies on how to fund those efforts. And then finally, we have a next webinar for the World Urban Parks and Epley Institute, and it's going to be Free Market Perspectives, Park Systems, Emerging Cities to Industrialized Cities. And this one is going to be a little bit provocative. It'll be somebody who has a real strong free market urbanist perspective on these issues. And let's see, he'll be talking about, it'll be Aaron Wren with the Joel Kotkin School, and he'll be talking about cities from a free market perspective. So anyway, thanks everybody for joining, and thank you again to Yvonne and Herman for taking the time to share with everybody. And we'll close out. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.